By this time, it became apparent that they had travelled further upstream than she had planned, and the winds needed in the ferrying of troops across the river on barges were unfavourable, making for a protracted and now dangerous delay. So she approached poor Dunois as he was giving orders on the riverbank and reprimanded him in front of all the soldiers, as he later recalled in the following manner. "Are you the bâtard d'Orléans?" I replied, "I am he, and I rejoice at your arrival." And then she said to me, "Was it you who decided that I should come here, to this side of the river, rather than going straight to where Talbot and the English are?" I replied that myself and others wiser than I had given this counsel, believing it to be better and safer. Then Joan replied in this manner, "In God's name, the counsel of God our Lord is safer and wiser than yours. You thought to deceive me, and you deceive yourselves more, because I bring you better aid than ever came to any soldier or city, because it is aid from the King of Heaven. Nevertheless, it proceeds not from love of me, but from God himself, who, at the request of Saint Louis and Saint Charlemagne, took pity on the city of Orléans, not wishing to allow the enemy to have both the body of the Lord of Orléans and also his city." Suddenly, he reported in his memoirs, as did a number of others, the wind changed direction, and the crossing substantially eased. Dunois notes in his recollection, "From that point I had good hope in her." Nevertheless, there were not enough vessels to transport the entire army and baggage train, so the majority of the troops had to backtrack to Blois and go around the more dangerous way. Joan, Dunois, and a small contingent of troops continued on towards the city, which was besieged on 3 sides by a ring of heavily defended forts and redoubts that could only be approached by its eastern gate. Such was the anticipation of her arrival that she had to sneak in during the middle of the night, her commanders fearing an unmanageable mob that might be vulnerable to bombardment. But the next morning, swelling crowds of men, women, and children surged toward her accommodation, so she rode out to meet them on her white steed, flag unfurled, and escorted by her retinue. Dunois and the other commanders riding behind her had never seen anything like it. She was mobbed by the adoring crowd, who wept and pressed in just to touch her or even her horse as she rode by, encouraging them to stay strong. She wasted no time and sent heralds out to the English commander Talbot, calling on him to retire or surrender as before. The English responded by arresting one of the messengers against all the rules of warfare and threatened to burn him at the stake for representing a sorceress, as they came to see her. By the 4th of May, almost a week later, the relief column was finally spotted, and Joan rode out with 500 soldiers to cover their approach, but the enemy made no attempt to molest them. The inhabitants were overjoyed at both the food and reinforcements that came through the gate, and after some merriment, they retired for the night. Joan's page-boy was tasked with informing her of any action that might occur while she slept, so that she could ride out to support the troops. But when Dunois later that night launched an attack on one of the forts with 1,500 men, the page-boy was reluctant to wake her. Nevertheless, she jumped up with a start and cried out that the blood of France was being spilled, ordering him to fetch her horse while she adjusted her armour. As she rode out to the scene of the carnage, it was clear that things were not going well, with the stream of wounded being carried back to the rear of the lines. She charged in among the troops and rallied them such that when the English saw her, their morale collapsed and the fort was soon taken. As dawn broke and the carnage became apparent, she wept, warning the soldiers to take confession that day and give thanks for their victory, Otherwise, she would depart from them, and all would be lost. On the other hand, if they remained faithful, she promised them the siege would end within 5 days. No small promise, given that by now it had been going on for 6 months at least. The next day, being a holy day, saw the two sides declare a truce, during which all the French and Allied commanders met to discuss the next day's action. Tellingly, Joan was excluded from the war cabinet, which had decided on a diversionary assault on one fort to draw the English away from another that was their main target. When Joan was finally admitted to the chamber, she was only told of the first assault, and she smelled a rat right away, chastising Dunois for treating her like an idiot. Diplomatically, he replied that the attack plan they told her was indeed the true one, but that they had a backup plan in case that one didn't work. This seemed to placate her for the time being, and everyone went about their work preparing for the next day. As dawn broke, French troops streamed across the bridge leading to the former fort, but it was very well defended, and they began to break off, with many aware that it was just a ruse anyway. Suddenly, Joan and another commander, the impetuous and fiery mercenary La Hire, appeared on the bank, having been ferried across by rowboat, and they charged toward the English lines, joined by yet more cavalry, mowing through the English who had just come out to harass the French withdrawal. The English now retreated into a more secure stronghold nearby, and were putting up stiff resistance when Joan ordered some culverin artillery fire into the palisade breach they were trying to enter. This caused enough mayhem that the French, again emboldened by her lead, stormed into the fort and captured it, to the great shock of Dunois and the others, who didn't think the capture of the fort was possible. They now set about surrounding the Tourelle fort, which was the key position and bombard location held by the English, and without which the entire siege would fail. Later that evening, she told her confessor that tomorrow she would be wounded above the breast, and that he should take pains to pray to the Lord all day for their deliverance. Apparently, she had previously foretold of her own coming injury, and was now convinced that tomorrow was to be that day. So it was that on the 7th of May, at dawn, the French assault on Tourelle began. A number of the English defenders were later to record that the French streamed in with such vigour, wielding axes, clubs, and even bare fists, that it seemed they thought they were immortal. The fighting was desperate and lasting till dark, with Joan riding at the front, flag unfurled, always among the soldiers, exhorting them to give their best, never to give up, and that the fortress would soon be theirs. Just then, as she predicted, she was hit by an arrow, between the neck and the shoulder, which penetrated with such force it protruded out of her back and knocked her clean off her horse. She was carried to the rear and wept with the pain, while commanders struggled to maintain the now faltering attack. Seeing they were about to call off the assault, she pulled herself to her feet, limped off to a nearby vineyard for a moment of prayer, and soon returned, no longer in tears, asking for help in mounting her horse, to the protest of her aides, who feared she would pass out from blood loss. Nevertheless, they rode back out with her to the lines, where she took charge of her banner once again and rallied the troops nearby to carry it to the bulwark of the fort. If it touched the wall, or the wind blew it toward, the fortress would fall. The soldiers surged once again at her cries, and as the flag touched the walls, the defenders, shocked at seeing this sorceress back on her horse and screaming, having seen her take a bolt to the neck, fled in terror as all resistance began to crumble. She made her way to the drawbridge, upon which stood the commander, Glasdale, with the last of his few knights, in a desperate bid to hold off the French. She called on him to submit in the name of God, and said to him that, despite his previously calling her a whore, she had great pity for his soul and that of his people. Glasdale appeared unmoved, and the bridge suddenly collapsed, with he and his knights drowning in the moat under the weight of their own armour. Reports tell us that on that day there fell not more than 100 Frenchmen of all ranks, while the English lost several thousand. The next day, May the 9th, saw the English abandon their siege positions and instead draw up battle in front of the city to take on the French army head to head. Joan, despite being the worse for wear and unable to wear her armour, instead put on a jasserin, a light coat of mail, and rode out with her commanders to survey the scene. The French, eager to capitalise on their momentum of victory, had to be restrained by her from attacking, as it was a Sunday, and she felt it would be a sin to initiate battle that day. It seems the English, bruised and demoralised after 6 months of a failed siege, had lost the stomach to fight as well, and after an hour of tense standoff, they broke off their lines and proceeded to withdraw in good order to their nearby stronghold of Meung-sur-Loire. Some of Joan's commanders were desperate to mop up the English rearguard, but she chastised them as well and admonished them to spend the day in prayer and thanksgiving instead. The city erupted into celebration as church bells rang in triumphal enthusiasm all day. The news spread fast and far of the miracle performed by the girl, now frequently referred to as the Maid of Orleans. She and Dunois wasted no time reporting back to the Dauphin, and Charles received them 3 days after the battle, overjoyed at the success that Dunois and a number of other commanders squarely and publicly attributed to her courage and participation. The Duke of Alençon, examining the English positions after the battle, declared that they were so well fortified that a handful of defenders could have easily held off 10 times their number, such that their collapse must surely have been a miracle of Joan's making. Indeed, even the English, despite their unflattering abuse, conceded that their